Hello everyone, thanks for joining me on today's 172nd Air Wing review. We have up today the delightfully beautiful CF-101 Voodoo. This one in the colors of 409 Squadron named Nighthawks out of Comox, British Columbia. The F-101's history is it's a bit interesting to get into and to take a moment. For those of you new to my channel, first of all, welcome. Second, when I review 172nd models, I will use some details about the airplane's history before we get into the model details and some of the pros and cons of owning it and whether it's a good addition to your collection or not. And the reason I do that is to do justice to the stories behind the aircraft that they're modeled after. We don't see the stories of the munitions loaders, the system testers, the life support personnel, the aviation ground equipment, the maintainers, plane captains, and crew chiefs. We don't see their stories in IMAX on the big screen because Hollywood long ago figured out that it's easier to make movies about guys like Maverick because people will pay money to see stories about those kind of things. But at the end of the day, every aircraft sortie is a team effort, and I want to do justice to the stories of those people who are behind the scenes of every aircraft that's ever served, and many that never got a chance to. So to do justice to those stories and to their families, I go into some of the history of the modeled airplane, because at the end of the day, it's to answer the question of why. Why should you consider adding this particular release to your, to your display deck? I mean, everybody has limited time and limited resources, and we can't own all of them, try as we might. So at the end of the day, what counts is not just the detail of the model, but the stories behind it. And that is something that I feel is the least I can do, is to do justice to the people who have served around them as well. So with that all outlined, we'll get into some of the background behind why this airplane exists and why it's carrying in this shot two 3,000 kiloton nuclear weapons. Yeah, it has air-to-air nuclear missiles, and the concept is not as crazy as it sounds. But to explain why it's a logical decision, we have to take a little trip back in time to the early years of the Cold War. Because in the early years of the Cold War, the defensive picture was much different than the way the world is now. Many of you know that in air combat today, there's radar, there's air-to-air missiles, electronic warfare, radar warning receivers, countermeasures and technologies and various things, and low observability, stealth, etc., etc. But the world was a different place in 1958 when the first F-101B was flown and accepted by the U.S. Air Force. You see, the North American Air Defense Command, or NORAD, had a singular problem. And that problem was stopping the Soviet Union's fleet of about 60 to 70 Tu-95 Bear nuclear bombers. Now, these bombers were a little bit different than your World War II variety because they carried significantly more firepower. Those bombers carried enough nuclear material between them to kill multiple cities each. And that poses some interesting and actually very serious problems for an organization like NORAD that at the time had to figure out a way to safeguard North America from a Soviet Union nuclear invasion. You have to remember, Stalin was in charge of the Soviet Union at this point in history, and that was not a nice guy, to put it mildly. He's a guy that was responsible for, among other crimes, killing millions of his own Soviet people by his own government's policies and procedures. So if a guy in charge of a country kills millions of his own people, you can imagine how much regard he's going to have for millions of somebody else's country, right? So stopping these Soviet bombers entailed some interesting logistical challenges. You see, in the world of the Cold War, it was thought that World War III would consist of the U.S. sending offensive bombers to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union sending their fleet of offensive bombers over the pole to attack North American cities. And while Canada may not have been the primary target at first, it doesn't take a nuclear physicist to figure out that if the Soviets nuke major cities in America, Canada is going to suffer the fallout, as many of the people who live in the Detroit metro area will probably know from firsthand experience, among other areas. So if Seattle gets nuked, it's not like Vancouver is going to come out of it okay. So the defense of America and defense of Canada from these Soviet bombers was a joint problem, and it required a joint solution. So to stop bombers, you couldn't use the World War II tactics anymore because bombers are big, heavy, and relatively sturdy airplanes with multiple engines. If you sent interceptors against these and they have guns, the bomber is probably going to just shrug them off. And further, an interceptor airplane would be limited in the amount of ammunition it could carry. And there's no assurance that you would have enough ammunition to intercept and shoot down each and every one of those 70-odd bombers before they got to a position to deploy their weapons. Remember, if one bomber gets through, that's multiple cities, millions of people who don't have a tomorrow. So the job of the interceptors was fairly serious. Preventing Armageddon is a common plot point in a lot of Hollywood films, tales, books, and movies and media of that sort. But this was literally the responsibility of the people who flew these F-101s. And what they had to do was to stop these bombers in a way that would be decisive, effective, and didn't use a lot of ammunition. And so the solution was devised in the form of the AIR-2 Genie nuclear air-to-air missile. Each Genie has 1.3 kilo, that's 1,000 tons of explosive power in its warhead. And the idea was each of these CF-101s and U.S. Air Force F-101 contemporaries would carry two of them underneath the front of the aircraft. Now, the Genie was used in multiple aircraft in the time, such as the F-89, F-106, as well as, of course, the U.S. Air Force F-101. But these bombs, or excuse me, these missiles carried quite a wallop. It was essentially a nuclear bomb strapped to a rocket and put on a fighter jet. And the idea was you would, well, spare you the trouble. We'll just roll the footage of the people who were testing these things. There was an instance where an F-89 was used to launch a test rocket, which was detonated in an Operation Plumbbob, which was a nuclear test conducted in the 1960s. And this test was to demonstrate the lethality of the AR-2 Genie's warhead. And so suffice it to say that when you have 1.3 to 1.5 thousand tons of explosive power, that's a very big boom. And you can see that in the footage when the guys react once the shockwave hits them. So this is, and this H airplane carries two, remember. So one Voodoo, like one CF-101 would have potentially 3,000 tons of explosive power in its payload bay. And the Canadians would eventually end up operating 300 and, they would operate 112 of them over the course of their 20-year time with the Royal Canadian Air Force. 367 of them would be used by the U.S. Air Force, a batch of which would be swapped with some earlier ones. And this particular aircraft, 030, was part of the new batch. So in the 1960s, the U.S. Air Force swapped the worn-out older Voodoos for new, more upgraded ones, which included some enhancements, such as a better radar, a better infrared sight, which you see up here, the better engines, which included the better Pratt & Whitney J55P85 motors, as well as some avionics improvements, and of course, lesser airframe life, so much more durable aircraft. And these Voodoos would continue to serve all the way until 1987. So again, they had a fairly long term, and they were very effective. If you picture 112 CF-101s, each of them armed with 2 nuclear weapons, that would be a fairly formidable barrier to anything trying to illegally cross into North American territory. So as time went on, of course, the Soviet Union and the United States moved on from using nuclear bombers exclusively to building ground-launched nuclear missiles that could cross continents and oceans. And these missiles would also be installed in submarines operated by both nations. So as time went on, the need to defend the country from an overland bomber attack was diminished a little bit. But still, the job of safeguarding the northern approaches of the North American continent was a very important one, as once again, these pilots literally had the responsibility of defending Armageddon. Not a carrier fleet, not an air base, not a theater, not a front line, but safeguarding millions and millions and millions of people from nuclear Armageddon. It was a very heavy responsibility, and fortunately, the CF-101 was up to the job. With 2 Pratt & Whitney J57 engines, this airplane had a very high climb rate. It was actually called by some crews, the 10 Wonder, kind of a play on the CF-101 name. And that's because it climbed so fast that from ground to 25,000 feet, it was the fastest climbing airplane in the U.S. Air Force inventory. It was actually faster than the SR-71 and the F-104. Now, the F-104 Starfighter and the SR-71 did get a better advantage above 25,000 feet, which is, of course, why those airplanes were, in the end, a little bit faster. The F-104 was a little bit faster. The SR-71 was, of course, extraordinarily faster. But in initial climb rate, the F-101 series of airplanes was very, very fast, especially for 1950s technology. And there's a humorous story of an F-101 racing an SR-71 in California, and I hope earnestly it's true. We have to be careful when you source things on the internet, but apparently the F-101 followed an SR-71 initially, and when they got to approximately 25,000 to 30,000 feet, the F-101 pilot got on the radio and said, well, it's all well and good that you have this long pointy nose airplane, but it's not really that impressive. We're keeping up with you. And of course, at that altitude, that was when they were able to put the throttles forward on the SR-71 and leave the Port Voodoo in the dust. So it does say something about the capabilities of this airplane, that it was capable of Mach 1.8 and had a better climb rate than almost anything else in the U.S. inventory at that time. So as an interceptor, it formed a very crucial part of North American Air Defense Command and the Royal Canadian Air Force's guardian of the northern approaches. And of course, it's not something that you're going to see in a Hollywood movie because no shots were ever fired. But thanks to this aircraft and the people who served with it and flew it and maintained it and worked on it, interesting side note, they call the maintainers of the Voodoo Voodoo Witch Doctors, which is just a hilariously cool little patch if you ever want to Google it sometime. But, all those people that worked around this aircraft, they did an important job. And it's interesting that the majority of people today have almost no idea that this airplane served the way that it did between the U.S. Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force for decades. So 409 Squadron would fly the Voodoo all the way up until the adoption of the CF-18 Hornet in 1984. So when they switched to the CF-18 Hornet, the nuclear mission of the Voodoo was retired, and the weapons, which were owned by the U.S. Air Force, were returned to the American territory, and Canada moved on to using the CF-18 for air defense duties, a duty which to this day the CF-18 still maintains as I make this video now. So very good history behind this aircraft, and I think for that reason alone, Canadian Voodoo does deserve a place in your collection. But this Canadian Voodoo, well, let's talk about that. So this Voodoo is featured with 2 external fuel tanks, which you will see in the introductory footage, as well as a rotating weapons bay. So the rotating weapons bay right now shows the 2 AIR-2 Genie missiles that I just described earlier. A lot of nuclear bing boom going on there. Interesting note, they called these missiles colloquially the ding dong because when these were fired, they had a huge rocket plume and, well, it looks like a giant bomb underneath the airplane. So you've got 2 of these nuclear AR-2 air-to-air missiles. And on the other side of the armament door, you will see 2 AIM-4 Falcons. Special note about the Falcons, the AIM-4 is an interceptor missile, and it was designed to be used against, again, Tu-95 bombers. It was engineered in 1948, and I'm going to go into some detail about the AIM-4 because I think people have a misconception of what it was designed to do versus what happened to it in Southeast Asia later. Essentially, the AIM-4 was designed in 1948. It was the first infrared-guided air-to-air missile that the U.S. adopted and built, and it was built to hit bombers, period. It was designed to look at, track, and engage high-flying, high-speed nuclear bombers like the aforementioned Tu-95 from Russia. And the point was, you would have an interceptor. The interceptor, such as one of these CF-101s, would be vectored by ground control or radio guidance or its onboard radar. In this case, a Hughes MG-13 system. It would be vectored to intercept a bomber, and then the air-to-air missile would be cued to that bomber through a computer system, most of which would be in the front. So you would have the avionics and all the 1950s era vacuum tubes and wiring and everything up here. So for the time, it was a very sophisticated system. Now it looks all very Rube Goldbergian, and of course there's more computing power in the in the wristwatches and in the pockets of most people these days. But back in the day, it was very, very advanced technology at the time, and it would compute when to launch the missile. So when an F-101 or CF-101 would get into position, either head on, to the side, or behind to engage a target, what would happen is the radar, either the radar or the infrared system, would lock on to the bomber. The Hughes MG-13 guidance system in the nose would calculate, with its various functions and systems, the optimum time to launch the AIM-4. Once the optimum time was reached, The computer system on board the airplane would show a launch indicator, meaning the system is ready to launch and has the target. The pilot would press a button on the control stick to give consent to launch, at which point the computer system would then rotate the weapons bay, prime and cool the seeker head of the AIM-4, which you see right here is the red little rocket underneath in the bottom, and then it would fully rotate the weapons bay, launch the AIM-4, and it would do so almost automatically. The only part that would involve crew coordination would be locking onto the target initially and giving the consent to launch. And I'm going into all this about the AIM-4 because the AIM-4 would be victim of some politicizing later. So the AIM-4 was not built with what's called a proximity fuse, meaning if it flies next to the target, it goes off. The AIM-4 was deliberately not built with that because if you're taking down a large 4-engine bomber, you want the missile to go into the airplane to do maximum damage. If it goes off from a proximity detonation, it's unlikely to do much damage, which when you're talking about something carrying city-killing nuclear weapons, you want to do as much damage as you possibly can. So the AIM-4 was designed for that mission, and when used in that role, it was very effective. It was very accurate. The computer system for its time was fairly reliable, and it was robust. So and it had to be because the CF-101 had to work in environments of high temperature, and it had to work in the depths of the Canadian winter when it's -20 on the flight line and it's blowing wind. So you can't have an airplane that breaks down in the cold weather just because it's below wind chill, right? So this is all very key stuff here. The AIM-4 would be bludgeoned onto the F-4 Phantom II in Southeast Asia because of some bickering between the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy on what to do with the next iterations of the AIM-9 Sidewinder. So just as a recap of what would be enough info for its own video, frankly, the F-4 Phantom II, which is like a cousin airplane to this CF-101, was deployed to Southeast Asia with the AIM-9B Sidewinder, which is a different air-to-air missile. The U.S. Air Force wanted to direct the next direction of the AIM-9, but the AIM-9 was a Navy project. In a classic case of service branch politics, the U.S. Air Force disagreed with the Navy on certain specifications. It escalated to the flag officer level, and eventually the U.S. Air Force said, well, we're just going to get rid of those Navy missiles. We're going to put our own. And they bludgeoned the AIM-4 onto the F-4 Phantom without the Hughes guidance system and technology around that missile, which is kind of like taking a sniper rifle, putting it in a holster, and then walking around with it as if it's a personal defense weapon. It's just not built for that. And sure enough, when Ronald and those people down at the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing in Thailand tried to use a bomber-killing missile to shoot down itty-bitty little dodgy little MiGs, bad things happened. The MiGs basically got away. The missiles rarely worked. I think 5 firings out of 20, not even that, maybe 5 firings out of 100 worked. That had an abysmal kill record, and Ronald went on record to say that the missile was totally useless. Useless is the third tit on a bore, if you pardon the expression, and the AIM-4s were taken off their Phantoms and the AIM-9s were substituted back on. That's how badly they performed. So after that, the missile got an undue reputation of being dead weight. And unfortunately, some of the crews that flew the CF-101 kind of felt this way too. The Air Force folks that flew the F-101 were very confident in the AIM-4's capability as long as it was paired with the computer system it was designed to be used with. So it's interesting that the AIM-4's reputation was so savagely ruined because of what came down to inter-service spat. What should have happened is the AIM-4 should never have been adapted to the Phantom in the first place because the Phantom was simply not built to carry that missile. Some other solution that might have actually worked should have been drafted instead of taking a weapon not intended to be used in that theater and used in that theater. So it does say something for the missile that even though it was never intended to be used for that, they got 5 kills out of 100 with a weapon that was never designed to shoot at MiGs in the first place. So when it comes to engaging bombers, it would have been probably a fairly solid choice in its assigned mission had World War III gone down and the 1.5 kiloton AR-2 Genies, for some reason, didn't all knock out the bombers. So with all that wonderful history outlined, let's talk about some of the details on the model, right? It is a model review. Don't think that I forgot. But after doing justice to some of the history, let's cover what this brings to the table into your display case. So the first thing to talk about, pros. For one thing, it's the F-101 is just a gorgeous airplane. I had the privilege of seeing one of these in person. You might have seen some of that in the intro footage of the cockpit. Side note, the instrument panel was detached from the frame, which I'm sorry to say that was the condition of it when I got there. There's a story from U.S. Air Force pilot George Merritt, who flew F-101s as part of his career and before he became a test pilot, and he had recounted some very interesting stories about flying these during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And one of the stories he shared about his time in the F-101 was one of the pilots that he knew, he didn't have this happen to him personally, but one of the pilots that he knew on takeoff, apparently that the instrument panel came off in his lap while the jet was on takeoff roll. And the F-101, it accelerates so very quickly that in the time it takes me to say that phrase, the airplane has already crossed 160, 170, 180 knots, and you have to raise the landing gear and the flaps very, very quickly. It's so fast, in fact, that pilots got in trouble because they would go too fast. The landing gear would get stuck in the down position, and there would be problems. Well, not really problems, but they would have to slow down, get below 250 knots, and then recycle the landing gear process. And then they would have to land and then pay for everyone's bar tab because they look like an idiot, and that's just not something fighter pilots do, right? So he recounted the tale of how one time one of his flight mates was taking off, and the instrument panel came off in his lap, basically in the same way that you see in that intro shot with the instrument panel just hanging down. And in the F-101, that's actually a very serious condition because the design of the airplane, it's so elegant, but it is an aerodynamic concern, because what happens is when the airplane is nosing up, when it's putting its nose high, the airflow coming off of the fuselage and the wings can block the aft tail. And when that happens, the aft tail can no longer control the airplane, and the nose will suddenly do what's called a pitch up. And if that happens below 10,000 feet, you have to eject. There's no way to recover the airplane. So a pitch up is a condition that's fairly serious in the F-101. There was a computer system installed that would keep the pilots out of dangerous regimes, but it was deactivated on landing and in takeoff, just because you don't want a computer doing funny things on the airplane when you are in those phases of flight. So when the instrument panel came off in the guy's lap, it pushed the stick back, and it put the airplane at a high angle of attack at low speed, which is not good. So thinking on his feet, his compatriot had to push the stick forward with one of his hands, and the other hand he had to push the instrument panel off of the stick, and then it had to basically sit on his knees until he could call the air traffic supervisor of flying and get clearance to come back and land for an emergency, since he's holding up his instrument panel with his knees. So interesting story that just popped to my head when I went to the museum there and saw that F-101 with the panel in his lap. Now, the specification differences between the CF-101 and the Air Force F-101 are fairly minor. Some Canadian-specific radio stuff, but mostly they're basically the same airplane in terms of structure and fit. So we can refer to the CF-101 and the U.S. Air Force F-101 more or less interchangeably when it comes to flying and system capabilities. So back to the fun stuff, right? Tangent over. The F-101 is it's an elegant model. I'm glad to say that HobbyMaster's done a good job of rendering the paint in this aircraft. So the Royal Canadian Air Force color schemes, I think, look really nice. They are way more adventurous than the Air Force was, although the Texas Air National Guard F-101Bs do look pretty darn fetching. Again, after having seen this in person, I'm glad to share that besides one detail that we'll get to, HobbyMaster's done a good job of rendering the colors, and including the canopy window lining as well. There is one minor nitpick to note. The front of the windshield, there should be some there should be thicker framing up front than there is rendered, but it's not a major deal. It's certainly not something that can't be corrected with a small paintbrush and 5 seconds of effort. If you look at the front of a F-101 and you look at the front of a HobbyMaster model, you'll see a little difference there. But at the end of it all, the shape is good. The shape's accurate. I'm glad to say that they pretty much kept it legit to the real airplane. Having seen the real thing in person, let me tell you, the Voodoo is a big girl. It's a big airplane. If you're standing on the ground, your eye level is basically about where the tip of my pen is, right here. So you're looking pretty much there. And this is essentially eye level of the airplane as you're walking to the side of it. The back, the very back of the wing right here, thankfully they don't model this accurately or you'd cut your fingers, but the back of this is very, very sharp. It's about as thin as a piece of paper, which is an amazing level of precision on an airplane that's this big. And it's a huge one. It's a big ship. Like I said, though, very elegant, very 50s, very much like what you would draw if you were a kid and someone said, draw me a fighter plane. You know, I probably drew something that looked just like this when I was a, 5 or 6 year old or whatever. So anyways, the paint's good. The Nighthawk insignia for the 409 Squadron and the Canadian Air Force flag, as well as the striping for the Squadron insignia, all that's on point. That all looks pretty good, as well as the location of various things. And they even modeled the missile guide area here. There's a little but there's a strakes on both sides of the airplane. And the strakes are there to ensure that when an AR-2 missile is fired, that the massive amounts of smoke doesn't get sucked into the engine and cause what's called a compressor stall. So the idea of a jet engine is the air goes in, jet engine compresses and burns it, and then it goes out that way. If you have a pressure differential where there's less pressure back here, or you have a situation where the air is coming in and it stops, you get a pressure vacuum, your pressure differential, essentially, and then the engine goes in reverse, and that's not a good time for the engine, and really not a good time for anyone on the airplane when the engine does that. So those are called compressor stalls. It's a very oversimplified and non-detailed explanation of how that process goes. It's so complicated, actually, that people literally make a living just studying that kind of thing. But essentially, that's to avoid the engine from stalling. And these strakes here are designed to guide the missile smoke someplace less damaging than down the engine intake. So again, the colors look good, the shape is good. I'm also glad to see that they've modeled the weapons bay. I would have liked to see a little bit more resistance. I think the U.S. Air Force Voodoo that I have is a little bit better in this area, but it's not a big deal if the resistance of this is a little too light for your taste. I'm going to try to see if I can get this to stay on the aim 4 side of things. Nope, let's not get greedy. Getting crazy over here, trying to get that to work. But basically, yeah, this rotates, and they've modeled that pretty accurately. I would have liked to see one of those baggage pods that they carried, but maybe that's a too complex implementation. But in any event, the weapons bay rotates, and it rotates just like the actual airplane. So you got your red-tipped, or you say red-bodied, aim 4 Falcons on one side, and then you have your AR-2s on the other, which you see right there. And that's how they would be carried if they were ever to be deployed in a actual, interceptor situation. And the point of this, instead of having, say, a pylon on the side of the wings, was to reduce drag, because when you're flying an interceptor, you want to get to meet the threat as quickly as you possibly can. So that's to, of course, reduce drag. And the other thing I'm glad to say is right now they're pretty decent value. You can get them for about $110, $120, give or take, depending on shipping. So they're not too expensive, which is a good thing, because the Voodoos, once they sell out, they do go up in value extremely quickly. I was surprised to learn that one of the Voodoos in my collection is doubled in price, but maybe I'm not so surprised because it is a cool looking model. But the Voodoo, the Royal Canadian Voodoo that I had earlier on the channel, and that one, which has the special color scheme, the black and white, that has gone up furiously in value. Now, I don't expect this one might meet that trajectory, but I do think that once these sell out, they do go up in value pretty quick. So if you are even slightly interested in getting one, you have any casual interest in this, or you know somebody who was affiliated with 409 Squadron during the Voodoo's time, I would not wait. Now they're still fairly reasonable, but if you're watching this months after I publish this, who knows? That's always a risk with these kind of things. So one of the reasons I'm making the video now is I'm sticking to my rule of trying to get content out within relatively close proximity to when these are available for sale, so people aren't watching my videos and then they Google it and then they get disappointed because it's sold out and the secondary market people are charging $200 or something really crazy. So I try to avoid that as best I can, lacking a time machine, obviously. So all things considered, I think it's a good addition. For the cons, first one to note is the slime lights or the formation lights, which you might see on certain F-101 releases, like some of the U.S. Air Force ones. They are still molded into the tooling. So when there's a release like this one that does not have the slime or formation lights, the paint ends up getting put over it, which is a little jarring if you're looking really close at the model, but at the end of the day, it's not a major deal. I did mention earlier that the windshield frame is a little bit bigger on the actual airplane than it is on this one. The cockpit is really big, it's really roomy, which is true to form. This is a big airplane and the cockpit is huge on this aircraft. So they've captured this well. One minor thing, the windshield frame between your navigator, radar navigator, and the pilot up front, it's actually not supposed to be black, it's supposed to be transparent, so the radar navigator can see through to the front. That's a minor thing. One thing I do want to point out, which might be a little bit of a concern if you want to display your model with the crew in them, you do want to put a little bit of blue tack on the back of the what's the phrase, of the pilot figures, the pilot and the navigator figures, because there's so much room in that cockpit that if you don't do that and you move the model even a little bit, the pilot and the navigator end up moving around in there like they're doing the Macarena while they're sitting down. So just put a little bit of blue tack behind them on the backs just to keep them a little bit more secure, so that way you can display it, and if somebody closes or slams a door, that they're not suddenly to one side of the cockpit or the other, because it is very sensitive. There's that much room in there. So the other point to note, which may be a big con, may not be for you, but the landing gear, well, actually this probably would be a big con for everybody. The landing gear on the F-101 out of the box was broken. So one of the landing gear legs was actually missing. It was just, I opened the box and the landing gear and the landing gear door was just off in my hand. And sure enough, I think like a week later, when I went to put landing gear on the model, the other side, the starboard side main landing gear came apart in my hand too. So I don't know if it's just this particular one. It may be an issue with some of in the batch, or it could be an issue with the whole batch, but just be aware of that. If you're taking one of these, or you're buying it secondhand, just make sure that the seller includes intact landing gear, because if it's a widespread issue, that might be a concern. So it's an easy problem to fix, fortunately, if you just take some glue and put the landing gear back in the slot. It's a fairly straightforward fix. You don't have to file or do anything weird. If you just put another piece of glue on there, you should be solid. But just be aware of that, especially if you're buying these secondhand and it's been months after I've published this. So that way you don't get one of these and find out that the seller either didn't include landing gear, or they broke it, or it broke in their hands and they just left it off of the listing or something. Again, if it comes apart, just be aware of it. But that was a disconcerting thing to see. And you know, it's worth pointing out that, you know, these things aren't cheap. So it's unfortunate when we see models that come with broken parts in the box. But unlike the situation with my Mirages, I'm glad to say that this was a much easier fix. So just bear in mind when you're ordering these. The other con to note is that the back of the aircraft, the paintwork here is it's something that I've mentioned before with HobbyMaster, how the back here is just this kind of lifeless flat gray. It almost looks as lifeless as the black background that you're looking at right now. It's just kind of this flat plastic dull gray deal. And in reality, the actual aircraft is actually silver. If you look at one of these in reality, I don't have footage of this, but if you look at these in person, you will see that the aft section of the Voodoo is, it looks reflective. And it's titanium. And it's titanium because the engine exhaust comes out in thousands of degrees, and you need some high strength, lightweight, and heat resistant material to cover the back of the airplane. So titanium is generally used, and it has kind of this reflective silvery appearance, right? Which is not what it looks like back here. So the actual airplane, again, this is more of a silver patina. So unfortunately, what happens here is the back of the airplane, because it's the back of the airplane, tends to be in shadow in many of the example footage and photos that you'll see. So when you get up close to it, you see it's reflective silver, but when you see it parked or on a runway or flying right side up, all of this is in shadow. So what does it look like when you have a reflective silver part in shadow? It looks like this. It looks gray and flat and kind of, you know, that color. So unfortunately, modelers and decal sheets, and including HobbyMaster, get the misinterpretation that that is the color of the aft section of the Voodoos in real time all the time. And that's just not the case. It's only in shadow. So I'm going to publish a video in the future showing some of the project modifications that I've done on one of my Air Force Voodoo, my F-101B. And I did repaint this area so that it's much more reflective of the actual airplane based on what I've seen of it in person. And let me tell you, you'd be surprised just how much better your F-101s look when this section is accurately painted. So hopefully HobbyMaster can see around changing that in future releases. To me, it's not a deal breaker because I've got X32 titanium paint in my drawer, so that's a simple matter of just painting it titanium and calling it a day. But each of us has different comfort levels, and of course with die cast, you really don't want to do that, because if you were just going to break out paint and do things like that, you would get the kit, right? So, but just, you know, those of you that already have F-101s of this nature or other releases in the past, just bear in mind that that'll have to be, you should have titanium for that. Again, X32 for the engines, and then for the trim on the aft section of the aircraft, I used aluminum silver. I forget the paint code at the moment, but aluminum silver for that, and just put a little bit of weathering on this, and let me tell you, it looks absolutely awesome. It makes a good looking Voodoo that much better. So those are the pros and cons of this. Overall, I think for the price, it's a good release, which is awesome, because I think this is the only F-101B tooling out there, or CF-101 tooling out there. So if you are a Canadian Air Force fan, or a fan of the Cold War, or a fan of North America not being nuked in the last 40-something years, pick this one up. It's a good choice. And in the forthcoming video, I will show you all some ways of making a good model that much better. So thank you all again for tuning in and watching, and we will catch you in the next video.